Surprise, the LR3 is back. So my buyer for this car had it for a couple of weeks and then sent me a picture with a bunch of liquid on the ground and said, oh man, it broke down on me. He had it towed to a mechanic. The mechanic told him, you got a cracked radiator and a cracked oil pan, and that's going to be $3,600 to fix. I said, man, that ain't right. So I asked the mechanic for a picture of what was wrong. He said, here's the crack in your radiator. Well, that's not a cracked radiator. That's a hose barb. That the end caps on these radiators are plastic, so they're only going to last so long before they start to fail. This one has, the end of the hose barb has broken off, so there's just not much surface area for the clamp to bite onto to hold that hose on there. This hose runs to up here, the intake manifold, and this side goes to your throttle body. That's for warming the air when it's cold, etc. But my customer here got a replacement radiator from his local salvage yard. It's already got aluminum caps on the end and a metal hose barb there. So assuming this is actually the correct radiator, this will work out much better if it's leak free. So I'm going to test all that stuff before I tear this apart, because another easy fix for something like this, if you run into this problem, is just get yourself a brass coupler for that diameter, and you can JB weld a little sleeve coupler on top of this hose barb, and that'll give you another inch or so, however much you need. Then you can put a clamp on there and you'll have plenty of material to bite down to. Remember, this does not take a tremendous amount of pressure. These systems, this one's operating on 16 psi. So that mechanic wanted, you know, $1,000 or something to do this radiator, which is excessive. And the oil pan, he says, is the upper oil pan got a crack in it. I've been around the bottom. I don't know that that's true. It is leaking some oil. It appears to be coming from that rear seal, the rear portion of the upper oil pan. So once I get the thing up in the air, we'll do a visual inspection, run a scope around it, see where it's leaking. And that was the other thing. Now I've got a cracked air line. So the thing is on the bump stops. I don't know if maybe he was riding around with the car lowered, or if the air suspension failed and blew some air out and put it on the bump stops and then hit a pothole and then just bumped this line off, and then obviously lost coolant, overheated, started to run rough, and going to the shop is just when they said, oh, by the way, you got an oil leak. Maybe that's all related, maybe it's not. Also, the battery is dead. It was from 2020, so that's 5 years old. Need to replace that. Let's tear it apart and find out exactly what we're dealing with. The supplied radiator is incorrect, so I'm gonna have to seek an alternate solution for that. Now I'm onto the oil leak. We can see it's actively dripping. I just jacked it up. So here we are, right here. So I'm going to pull the lower pan off, and then we're going to pull the upper pan off and check all the seals. I've got a car on the lift right now, so we're going to do this on jack stands, okay? To get to the upper oil pan on this 4-liter Ford, which is this aluminum case right here, you first have to remove the lower oil pan. So I've already drained the oil. Now I'm just going to pull all those 10mm bolts off of the steel oil pan and see if I can snake it out between this front axle and the cross member. Alright, the lower pan comes off easy peasy. It just kind of slips downward out the back. And now we can see there's the oil pickup. Looks like it's got a couple of pieces of plastic in there from some timing cassette So we'll investigate that further once we get this middle pan off. So it's an 8mm holding on the oil pickup. That thing will slip out. And we've got two different size bolts holding this upper oil pan in place. These look like some 13mm bolts, and looks like we might have some 10mm on there around the outside that fasten it to the skirt of the block. So let's loosen that stuff up. I've got all of the bolts out. So we've got the 13mm bolts that come out here, and then on the outside, the perimeter, are a bunch of 10mm hex bolts. But there are two T30 Torx in these little D-shaped windows. One goes up there and one goes up here. They're kind of tucked up in there. So what I'm going to do as a tool for that, I've got my extension for my impact driver, which this stuff is essentially a 1/4" socket. And then I've got my Harbor Freight T30. I'm just going to zip this off with the reciprocating saw so this will slip inside my impact driver, and then I can just pull those bolts out and see how it works. Oh man, am I glad I remembered that I had these little Harbor Freight driver sets. These are actually pretty good little kits, just hand drivers. And I've got a T30, a long one, already in there, so I don't have to cut up my other tool. So let me yank those two Torx out, and then we'll see if that pan will just come out. Okay, all the bolts are out. The really long Torx and the short one, that worked out real good. They are T30s. There were two more bolts holding the bell housing to this upper oil pan. 13mm, those come out the back going that way. So now I'm ready to see if I can knock this pan loose. First, what I'm going to try is just a rubber mallet, and I'm just going to kind of knock on it. You know, if that doesn't knock it loose, then I may get a wooden block and a brass hammer. But we're going to break the seal on that gasket and then see if it will just come out. So here we go. We got the upper pan loose. It's about 2 inches separated from the block, but because this is a 4-wheel drive and we got a front axle here, we can't get this pan out without raising the engine. So now it's time to loosen the engine mounts, driver and passenger, get those off and raise the engine about 3 inches. Hopefully that'll get us enough clearance to slip the back down and just kind of slide it out. It is possible to slip in a new gasket without pulling this upper oil pan, but there's no guarantee that you're going to get it to seal. You really need to be able to clean both surfaces really well and put some sealant exactly where you need it. And I really want to give this pan a visual inspection so I can rule out the possibility of it being cracked like the other mechanic said.
Nope, no, don't do that. There's a better way. Keep watching.
Yuck! Okay, you guys, this is actually becoming a real you-know-what. So, the oil pan basically won't come out like this. It's hitting the sway bar and cross member on the back. It's trapped between the axle and the engine block, so I can't. I've tried raising the engine just using jack stand, pushing up the front of the engine block, push it up basically as high as I can get it, which is getting me, you know, almost 3 inches off of the engine mounts, but it's not enough. So I just can't get this thing tilted enough to send it down. So my next best plan is to remove the axle. So basically we're going to pretend that we're doing a CV axle swap. So I'm going to have to pull off the wheel and the rotor and all that kind of stuff, get that out of the way, get the hub freed, pull the CV axle out, and then I can pull the axle tube or the housing off of the little differential, and that will open up this space to where the pan can come straight down. So the work here is the same as if you're going to replace a hub. Once we get to this point, we're just going to pull the axle shaft out. So I've got the caliper out of the way. It's just tucked on top of the sway bar. Those were 12mm bolts that hold the caliper in place. And then just disconnect the hose and wires and stuff like that, so you can swing it out of the way or suspend it off of the upper control arm with a cord. And then the caliper bracket was 21mm sockets, like so. And from there, we've got 15mm hex bolts, 4 of those holding the hub in. That I think it was a 1 1/8 is what I use. I'm sure there's a metric equivalent, but it was a 1 1/4 to get the hub nut off. This is a T50 Torx to get that rotor off of there. So if you're just doing a hub, then you just need to pull the brakes off, the rotor off, and that hub nut, the 1 1/4, and then these 15 mils, and then this pops off as soon as I pull these bolts out. But we're going to take it a step further to get the axle out. So the knuckle's going to have to come out of the way, and then pull the axle out. We'll tap it out from the inside. This hub came off super easy because it's new. I just did this job not very long ago. So I've got the axle shaft loose, but it's not going to go through the knuckle just yet because we can't get it inboard quite enough. So I've got to pull the steering linkage off so I can kind of drag the knuckle out of the way. So that's a 18mm. I just get the nut flush with the top of the stud, and then you can strike it with a brass hammer to loosen it. So now I've just got to put a hex key in there and then finish spinning the nut off. I'm going to use a ratcheting wrench to make that easy, and then I can pull the knuckle out of the way. Put the glove back on. Okay, there's the nut. There we go. Now this front knuckle is loose. Got plenty of room to get the axle out, so there we go. And I can tell this lower ball joint, man, that puppy is so loose. These things are toast. I mean, it wiggles around so freely. So this car really needs a ball joint job. These things are simple enough. It's just got a snap ring that holds it on there. So you pull that snap ring off, and then this ball joint stud just pops out through the top on the upper. On the lower, it'll pop out the bottom. You do obviously have to remove the knuckle. Put that on the list of things to do for this car. Now we're going to use some more brass and just knock the inner side of the CV axle to get it out of the axle housing. So once I have this axle removed from the car, then there's just 1 bolt over here on the outside of the axle housing, and then 4 bolts here up against the diff. And once that's out, then I can pull the oil pan out. I should have just captured that for you. That was relatively effortless. I've just got this wooden rod. It was an old closet rod. Keep stuff like this in the garage just for this occasion. Stuck it up against that the chunky part of the axle and just knocked it with a hammer, and it popped right out. So now let's slide that axle out. Look at that nice, beefy, chunky, lots of splines. I like that. Now, you can see the color, it's pretty chocolate milky. That tells me it needs some fresh lube in that differential. But now we can see there's the axle tube staring at us in the face. We've got one bolt on this side that we can kind of barely see, and some bolts right there. So we're going to pull that axle tube off. We'll see how long that takes. So this is a 15 millimeter, and I just knocked it loose. I really like using these offset wrenches because they're a bit longer than a traditional hand wrench, and you can just kind of knock it loose with the palm of your hand. But now you can see this bolt is spinning, so I'm going to go ahead and move to my ratcheting wrench so I can leave that on there while I hold this. It looks like it's an 8 millimeter stud in there, and now it's loose enough I can get it with my hand. Okay, so that is free. Just gonna knock that bolt out, and now let's turn around and do this side. So here we are staring at the side of the differential. We've got some 13 millimeter bolts. So 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. Of course, this is my oil pan that I want to get out of there, so let's just kind of move that around to get it out of the way. These are not on there like a He-Man tight or anything, so I'm not breaking my back trying to wrench these things off. Okay, so let me put my battery ratchet on this and speed this up, and then we'll just have to break the seal of this RTV or silicone or whatever to get this puppy off. Got the 4 bolts out of there, and I popped that long bolt out of this outer brace, and now the thing just kind of jiggles around. So I'm just grabbing the end of the axle, and this differential is mounted here. And it's got to mount up here, but it just kind of moves around. It's still not going to be enough with the axle tube there to let this oil pan out. So I'm going to go ahead and knock this with a rubber mallet and maybe stick a flat edge in here to break this seal of all that sealant, and then pull this thing off, and then we'll be halfway done. Check it out. That really only took a minute. So you can see we've got a sealed surface here just with some tube sealant, and then this just fits inside there. It's aluminum, so not a big deal. That's out of the way. Now, oil pan. There we go. It's out. Oh, my hands are oily. Hold on, I'm bringing the camera. Okay, here we go. And there she is. So all that, taking the axle out and everything to get to this upper oil pan. I understand you have the same kind of issues with a Ford Explorer or Mustang, the other Ford cars that this engine is shoved in. So if you have to do this rear seal, it's just a lot of work. But now we're going to clean this, give it a good inspection to make sure there's no cracks. I just don't think it's possible for this thing to be cracked unless you drop the car off of a crane onto a stump or something. So I think we're going to reuse this and stick her back up there. Alright, getting this block cleaned up. I want to point out what you need to focus on. So Also, you're going to put sealant here. This is the rear main cap. So that junction right there. Alright, and then you've got two spots up front, kind of the front main, which is here, is going to get some sealant, and right here. And then where this timing cover meets the block, this little seam on both sides. So that needs to be super clean. It's going to take some sealant, and that pan can go back up there. So for prepping the pan to go back on, what you want to focus on, this mating surface needs to be clean. Just use a little wire brush, maybe some parts cleaner, and a rag. The points you want to focus on are at the front main, at the rear main, and where the timing cover, this is the front, this where the timing cover meets the engine block, which is right here, between these corner bolt holes, and over here between these corner bolt holes. You want that stuff to be super clean and ready to accept sealant. When you lay that gasket on here, those are the 6 points that need to get some anaerobic sealant. Now these, I don't know what you call these little spacers in here, little spacer blocks. I'm using a 7/16 hex key. Those need to be backed out. This is the block side, this is the lower oil pan side. They need to be back down toward the lower oil pan. So when you put this thing up on the engine block, these are not proud of the surface, because you don't want those. See how this threaded little spacer block can come up out of the surface? You do not want that to contact the bottom of the block or the caps before you torque this pan down. So that's a good way to create some stress and put a crack in this aluminum pan. So make sure those things are backed out below this inner surface, and then we're ready to put some sealant on the block and lay the gasket on here. Now I'm going to note real quick the 8 bolts that go into the upper oil pan fastening it to the block. 2 of them are different. You see these are kind of silver in color, the rest are more like gray black. These 2 are the ones that get that washer that comes in your gasket kit. By the way, I would recommend the Felpro kit. Go ahead and spend 80 bucks and get a good gasket set so you're not doing this again. But these go in the front of the pan. So that's the back. Here's the front. 1, 2. Okay, those are outside of the lower oil pan. That's why it has those seals. Also, now those little hex keys that are inside there, they can get, you don't want to tighten them down. You go until they just touch the surface on the inside, so just until they stop turning. Those are in there to prevent this case from splitting whenever you torque down these bolts. So if that is absent, if you don't have those things in there and you start torquing this bolt down, it's going to pull up on this aluminum case and cause it to crack. So those are essentially acting as spacers in there. Have them backed out all the way as you do the perimeter bolts, and then go ahead and snug them up flush against the surface before you stick these bolts in there. Alright, still laying under the car. I'm ready to put the axle tube back in here. I've got all this stuff snugged down. You can find the torque pattern to this stuff and the values online. So I'm going to go ahead and change the oil filter, put a new one on there, then put the oil pickup tube back on here. That's kind of the last thing here. Put this axle tube and shaft back together, and then I can put the lower pan back on here. Let's spin around real quick though and look at this. So just make sure this surface is clean. We're going to put a little bead of sealant on there. I'll probably just use some Permatex Ultra Black before I put that tube back on there. And keep in mind that all this stuff, that sealant likes to sit for a little bit before you fill it up with oil and start exercising fluids. So just plan to give it, you know, 12 hours or so for that stuff to set up before you run the vehicle. Now let's take a look. I've got the light pointed. You can see that blue seal up in there. It's kind of the same color as my glove. That's the rear main portion of the Felpro gasket, and the corners, see if I can point to it. Yeah. See that kind of sharp corner? Focus, camera, yeah. That's where they tend to leak, right there at the corner on that side or over here on that side. So that's why it requires sealant being dabbed in those corners, as well as at the front main and where the timing cap comes to the block. So hopefully we're gonna have no leaks. Let's put her back together. All right, it's nighttime, so I'm not here with the light, but as you can see, suspension is fixed. That's normal ride height. Running good. No leaks. Holding coolant, holding oil. So I'm going to load this thing on the trailer. $218,502 and get it ready for delivery.